Dr. Deane Bowers has been happily employed at the University of Colorado since 1989. For those of you who weren't here in 1989, you could still afford to buy a house in Boulder for under $200,000. Her official title is Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and Curator of Entomology. Dr. Bowers has been fascinated by insects since an early age, and she considers herself fortunate to have been able to pursue her fascination throughout her life. The CU Museum of Natural History was started in 1902. In today's program, Dr. Bowers will provide some history of the early development of the museum and some of the important collections that are housed there. She will also talk about the value of these collections, why we still acquire collections, and describe some of the changes that she has seen in her 30 years at the museum. Dr. Bowers will then conclude, I think, because she's so passionate, by talking more specifically about the area for which she has the most intense passion, the insect collection. Please welcome Dr. Deane Bowers to Boulder Rotary Club.
All right, well, thank you so much, all of you, for coming, and thank you so much to the Rotary Club for inviting me here today. I only have 20 minutes, so I'm trying. I want to leave time for questions at the end. And I was really excited to be able to give this talk because as I was introduced, I'm the curator of the insect collection at the museum, but the museum is a lot more than collections, and so what I'd like to do today is tell you about the many facets of the museum and also introduce myself a little bit more and the kinds of things that I'm interested in as far as my research is concerned. So what I'm going to do today is talk first, just give you a little bit of a history about the CU Museum. How did the museum start? It's actually kind of fascinating, and some of the people who were involved in the beginning of the museum. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about how things have changed since I've been here at CU for the past 30 years, and there's actually been a lot of changes in the museum, as well as you all know, here in Boulder. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about why one of the goals of museums is to keep getting more stuff. What's the importance of that, and why do we keep doing that? And then talk about what is so important about museums in the next centuries. What do museums have to offer us as far as that's concerned? And as was said, my passion is insects, and so I'm going to be using the insect collection as a focus for a lot of the examples that I'm going to give. But I'm also happy to answer questions about insects in general at the end. So who am I? You got a brief introduction to me. I actually started getting interested in insects when I was about 7 years old, and my parents were really wonderful in encouraging that in me, even though my mom was terrified of grasshoppers. And my research focuses mostly on butterflies and moths. And on one end, I'm interested in the insects themselves, but I'm also interested in the organisms with which those insects interact. And to do that, I work mostly on butterflies and moths, but I've also done some work on pollinators. And I'm especially interested in the organisms that eat or infest these butterflies and moths, especially their caterpillars. So I do a lot of work with predators and pathogens of these insects. I also, as you were told, am the curator of the insect collection. And we have over 1 million insects in our collection, and it's been growing due to a lot of research efforts that are going on right now. I also teach our entomology class in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and these are some of my students out on a collecting trip. And I'm the chair of the Department of Ecology and Evolution, ending at the end of June. Yeah, there is a little to that. So, as I said, I'm mostly interested in the insects. And those insects, most insects are actually herbivores. They feed on plants. And so I'm interested in what's going on with plants and how the plant species that a particular insect feeds on can be important for that insect. And I'm especially interested in insects that have the ability to store disgusting tasting chemical compounds from the plants that they feed on, store them in their own bodies, and use those compounds as a defense against predators and pathogens. And so I'm interested in this multi-trophic cascade of plants, insects that feed on those plants, and predators and pathogens of those insect herbivores. And as I mentioned, I also do some work on pollinators and how pollinators and the chemical compounds that occur in nectar can be important for pollinators. But what I'm going to be spending most of my time talking about today is the Museum of Natural History. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history about the museum, how it was founded, and some of the colorful people that were involved in its founding. So the original home of the Museum of Natural History was in what is now the Anthropology Building on the CU campus, the Hale Building. And so when the museum was started, it was housed here. And the founder of the museum was Junius Henderson. And this is what the museum looked like in the beginning. These are some wonderful old photographs that I got from the library at CU. And Junius Henderson was paid no salary to found the museum. And he was just told, go take care of all these collections that are scattered all over campus, get them into one place, and do something with them. And so that's what he did. And so he was actually called the curator, the first curator, but he was really the first director of the museum and the founder of the museum. TDA Cockerell was the next, well, actually not the director, but he was very involved in the founding of the museum as well, in helping Henderson found the museum. And he did a lot of work on bees. So there's actually a lot of insects involved in the history of the CU Museum. He published almost 4,000 papers. And that's a heck of a lot of papers. And so he's shown here observing bees that are nesting in the ground down there. Francis Romali was also involved in putting together the museum, founding the museum, and the Romali building, which is the building where the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology is housed, is named after him. And he also had a really important role in starting a tradition that persists to today of research on mountain ecology. So the department still has a very strong component of its research that involves the mountains and things that go on in the mountains. We have a research station up there, and Romali was really involved in getting that whole research agenda going. Earl Morris was an anthropologist. I mean, does this guy look like a character or what? An early anthropologist who was also involved in getting the museum going and in really bringing a lot of the anthropological collections together. And someone told me that George Lucas was asked if he was the model for the Raiders of the Lost Ark character Indiana Jones, and he said no. But it looks like he could have been. So they had all this stuff going on. They were in Hale, and in 1937, actually with WPA money, a new museum came to Colorado. And so this started to be built in 1937, and here's a great article from the paper about it. And it was actually built really fast, in just a year and a half. And these are some old photographs of its construction. And this is an old picture of the finished version of the museum. And this is still where the public part of the museum and the anthropology collections are housed. So the opening of the museum in 1939, in 1937, so they built it within a year. So shown here, I know I don't have the mic, but this is Morris, Rodeck, Baer, and George Norland, the president of CU. But there's one really important person missing here, and that's Junius Henderson. And he unfortunately passed away 2 weeks before the official opening of the museum. Really sad. Okay, so the second director of the museum was Hugo Road, another entomologist, and he studied parasitic bees in the genus Nomada, a great name, and he was the director for a long time, for almost 40 years. And these are some of the really cool bees that he worked on, and we have a lot of his specimens in our insect collection. So one interesting thing about Rodeck, and I didn't know this until I started putting this talk together, is that he collected toilet paper. And he traveled a lot, and I guess there was a lot more variation in toilet paper back then. And so he collected toilet paper, he stored it in envelopes from the hotels that he stayed at, and he had actually hundreds of samples of toilet paper, and he donated them to, believe it or not, there is a toilet paper museum. So his collection is now housed and well cared for. I don't know where I have to look up the name of the museum. I'm sorry, I don't remember that. So we had some pretty colorful people that were involved in the founding of the museum. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about a few of the other directors before I go into a little bit more about the museum itself. So Peter Robinson, a paleontologist who's an emeritus professor and still around now, was the director for about 10 years. Bill Hay for a shorter period of time, also still around. Dave Armstrong, also still around. Dave was actually the director of the museum when I was hired. And then Linda Cordell. Linda Cordell was the first woman director of the museum. She was also a member of the National Academy of Sciences, which happened while she was the director, and unfortunately she passed away a couple of years ago. And the current director is Pat Koselleck, who works on diatoms. So how have things changed in the 30 years since I've been at the CU Museum? Well, there's been a lot of changes. So in the last 30 years, the number of curators has gone from 8 to 11. When I first came here, there was only one other woman who was a curator, Judith Harris. And now 8 out of the 11 curators are women. The number of specimens has gone from objects has gone from about 3 million to 5 million. So there's still a lot of active research going on that involves bringing specimens into the museum. We started a museum and field studies graduate program. And so this is a master's program that trains the next generation of museum professionals. And I'll say a couple more things about that later on. And so that began in the time that I've been here. And our home, initially, the Henderson building was the home of the museum and all the collections in the museum. And we've now expanded substantially. So we moved into what used to be the old geology building on campus. When geology got a new building, we moved in there. And so we have the entomology collections are there, paleontology and zoology. And then our herbarium, the plant collection, is housed in the basement of Claire Small. We have really active collecting and research going on in the museum, and things are getting kind of tight space-wise, even though we've expanded a lot. Okay, so one of the questions as a curator that I get asked a lot is why collect? Why do we keep collecting? If we have 5 million objects in our collection already, why do we keep adding more? So I'd like to talk a little bit about the value of doing that and why it's so important. So when Europeans started exploring the world, they found all these new, wild and crazy, wonderful things, and they brought them back. And they brought them back to show people how strange things were outside of Europe, since most of this exploration was from Europe. And so they put together what were called cabinets of curiosities, where they just displayed all these weird and crazy things that they were collecting. And these cabinets of curiosities were the prelude to the current museums, to the modern museum. And so they just took all the weird things that they found, they paid people to go bring back strange new things, and they showed them to their friends. And we actually have a room in the museum, the Bio Lounge, that's built on the idea of the Cabinet of Curiosities, where we change exhibits all the time. It's a place where students can come and work, but it's built on this idea of just showcasing all the wonderful things that we have in the museum. Now, museums are very different places. And so, what's going on in the museums of the 21st century? So we do have a lot of specimens and objects that have been collected, and these were finally, as museums started to really be not just a cabinet of curiosities, but an entity, to describe and organize the newly discovered world. And so this was a really important goal of museums, and now they weren't just bringing things back, but they were organizing them, they were studying them, they were using them to get information about the past, about cultures of the past, about organisms in the past. And this includes both the natural world as well as the cultural world. So collecting is not just, however, about looking at the past. It's also about describing what's still here that we don't know about. For example, here's a mammal, a new species of mammal that was just recently described. And it's pretty rare to describe a new mammal. Mammals are pretty well known. In contrast, insects are not very well known, so new species of insects are described all the time. So here's 3 new species of beetles. And I hope you can see down here, so they have these wonderful names. The genus is Gymnetus, but the species names are Drogani, Reguli, and Viscerionii. Does anybody recognize where those names come from? Game of Thrones, very good. Those were the dragons in Game of Thrones. So systematists and taxonomists can have fun naming new species. The last time I gave this talk, nobody knew that, so congratulations. So why collect? Okay, so I've been talking about specimens, but collections are a lot more than just the specimens. For example, we can use museum collections and current collecting to see how where organisms occur has changed. And given climate change and anthropogenic effects on our planet, where organisms occur is changing a lot. We can also use that to document what happens to certain groups of organisms. For example, it's from collections that we know a lot about what's going on with monarch butterflies and problems that we're having with monarch butterflies. They're also used to look at the evolutionary relationships among organisms. So this is an evolutionary tree of a group of plants, and it's by using material and collections that we can actually get an idea of where different species of plants or groups of plants originated. We can use these collections to look at interactions between different groups of organisms. We can look at these collections to look at variation within or among groups of organisms. And we can use these collections to train students who can then go on to be the museum professionals of the future. So we have 5 main sections in the museum. We have an entomology section, a zoology section, a herbarium, a plant section, a paleontology section, and an anthropology section. And the goals of each one of these collections are a little bit different. For example, the mammal collection doesn't go out and actively collect specimens anymore. The insect collection and the plant collection, however, do more of that. So how do we get new material if we're not actively collecting? For example, the vertebrate zoology collection. Well, we get donations of collections. For example, this is a grasshopper collection by a very famous grasshopper researcher that was donated to the entomology section. And this is a group of us. We went over to the Western Slope to pick up this collection. And so that's what so not only do we collect ourselves, but we acquire collections that way. But we still do active collecting. So this is my postdoc doing some collecting at Mesa Verde National Park, where we're doing a survey. They're interested in what organisms occur there. So we're doing the museum is doing a biological survey there. And these are some of the specimens that we've collected as part of that project. This is a recently acquired collection of tracks, fossil tracks. And so you're probably pretty familiar with dinosaur tracks or fossils, casts of tracks, but this is a fossil of spider footprints. Okay, pretty cool. And this was all a collection that was donated to the museum. Okay, but museums aren't only about the past, they're also a door to the future. And I think that's a really important component of what museums are doing now, and a component that's becoming more and more important. For example, the National Science Foundation is putting a lot of money into digitization and imaging of collections. So taking the data that occurs on a specimen, databasing it, and making that information available to researchers and the public worldwide. In the past, people had to come to museums, look at specimens, and it could take a huge amount of time to acquire this kind of information. And so by looking at the labels on specimens, by taking photographs of those specimens and making all that information available, it's made a huge change in what we can do with museum collections and the kinds of data that are available. So you can here's a beetle specimen from our collection right here, and it has this little identification tag. And so we can put this information in a database, we can barcode those specimens, and now people can say, okay, this beetle species, where did it occur in 1900? And where does it occur now? Does it still occur in the same place? Is it still around? Has it disappeared? So this occurs not just in natural history collections, but also in our anthropology collection. And so one of the coordinators of this effort is GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And so we can send all these data to GBIF, and then any of you can go to this website and get information about some plant that you find on a hike up on the Flatirons and find out where else it might occur. As I mentioned, we have a master's program in museum and field studies, and so we train graduate students in a variety of different techniques that are involved in the museum field, from education to exhibits to collections management. And if you have friends or children or grandchildren who might be interested in this program, you can find out about it on our website. We also have a public side of the museum. It's not just about collections, so we mount a variety of different exhibits. This was one a few years ago on the ancient Southwest. Right now we have an exhibit on genomics, on the use of not just little bits of DNA, but all the DNA in an organism to give you information about that organism. We also have an exhibit on Maria Martinez, a very famous Pueblo potter. Some past exhibits have been on the Mahaffey cache, which is a cache of stone tools found right here in Boulder, and then a really fun one on beetles. We also do a lot of education and outreach. We have school groups who come through. We have family days. I was talking to somebody who had brought her children to the museum, to our Discovery Corner, and to some of the programs. So we do a lot of interaction with the public. And we do a lot of citizen science. For example, the entomology section was involved with a program, The Bee's Needs, where we gave bee blocks to people who could take pictures of what bees were making nests in these blocks, and we could get an idea of what bee species were being found in different parts of Boulder County. Another thing is that as technology and the technological ability that we have increases as it is exponentially, we can do a lot of things with museum collections that we never knew we could do. For example, we can get DNA out of museum specimens, which can tell us something about the history of a particular group of organisms that we might not have been able to know anything about in the past. We can even get DNA from fossils now. So museum collections in the future are using the material that we have now to be able to then say things about what might happen in the future. So, for example, we can look at how the ranges of organisms might change. We can look at changes in phenology, so changes in when plant species are going to start blooming, or when you see particular birds migrating into a new area. We can document how pests have invaded new areas and their progress through those new areas. And we do all of that by using the material that's in museum collections. So not only are museum collections lots of specimens, but it's the information that's associated with those specimens that is also extremely important, and that I think is going to provide crucial information for looking at the impact of all the changes that are occurring on our planet and what the future of these organisms might be in the coming centuries. And so with that, I hope I've given you a little bit of a flavor of what the museum is like. And if you're interested in more information about the museum, you can check out our website, which is right here. And it has information about the programs that we have, that sort of thing. And I hope you'll take advantage of that. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for listening to me today. And I think I have a little bit of time left for questions. So thank you very much.
Do you have,
Yes.
do you or your docents encounter many people that simply don't accept evolution, or run into conflict with parents who don't want their children to be exposed to the ideas of evolution? And if so, what is your response, or what do you do?
So we haven't had that much at the museum about those kinds of things. I think in my experience, I've run into that more with students in some of our classes, where students say, well, okay, I know I have to learn this stuff, but I really don't believe in evolution. And for some of those people, information can change their minds. And for some of those people, it's a deeply held belief that anything that I say isn't going to be able to change. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't, the lights are kind of bright, so I can't see very well.
One of the things we really like about the museum is the lectures. And the lectures on all sorts of different things. Lately, a lot of lectures about the Southwest. More importantly, the lectures about ancient beer, along with the beer
I didn't go to that one, but I heard it was great.
There's been that a couple of times they've had that. It's been a great thing. But also all those lectures, you know, I think also associated with the planetarium and things like that, like for Chaco Canyon and other things like that. I think those are the greatest parts of the museum, is just being to the public about wonderful things going on for those things. Also like the Neanderthals years ago.
Well, that's really helpful to know, and I will certainly pass that on.
How popular is your master's program? Is it unique, or are there lots of similar programs?
So the question was about our master's program, and is it unique, or are there similar programs? And there are some similar programs. Ours, it's very popular. We have about 60 applicants for 8 to 9 positions. It's unusual among museum and field studies programs in that it's very collection-oriented and specifically oriented towards natural history collections. A lot of other museum studies programs are focused around anthropology collections or art collections. And we actually have a number of art students who get a certificate in our program, so we bring in people from art and art history as well. But it's a pretty popular program, and it's been very successful at placing its students in the museum field.
So just as a prelude, I wanted to let you know that it's called the Madison Museum of Bathroom Tissue. And so I got my collection of degrees there. I'm very proud. So,
thank you. Okay, write that down, everybody.
I've got a great
Madison Museum of Bathroom Tissue.
Tissue. Very
you.
polite. Here's my question. Could you comment a little bit on the connection between butterflies and moths, the evolutionary connection, and especially the stunningly beautiful wing patterns we see on butterflies?
Okay, so, well, as it happens, evolutionarily, the butterflies are sort of nested in the middle of moths. And so they're basically day-flying, brightly colored moths, even though they're called butterflies. Taxonomically, there's a couple of characters that distinguish butterflies from moths. One is in the way the wings are held together. So, they have 2 pairs of wings, and you don't want the 2 pairs flapping, 2 parts, the upper and lower wings flapping in different directions. They need to be held together so that they flap together. And the way that coupling is done is different between butterflies and moths. Also, their antennae are different. There's some other things like, okay, people say butterflies fly during the day, moths fly at night. There are a lot of moths that fly during the day. There are a lot of moths that you would think were butterflies by the way their wings look. And so you can't just say whether it's brightly colored or whether it flies during the day, whether it's a moth or a butterfly.
We hear that bee populations are being threatened by pesticides. Is that an accurate characterization? Are bee populations coming back?
Okay, sorry, I didn't hear the beginning.
We hear that bee populations are being threatened.
So the question was about bee populations. So certain species of bees, notably bumblebees, we do know that there are certain bumblebee species whose numbers are declining pretty dramatically. The use of pesticides is one component of that, but another component is increasing invasive plants. Another component, sort of sadly, for native bee communities has to do with honeybees. So honeybees are not native to North America. Some people call them an invasive species, but they were brought over by European settlers, so they're not native to North America at all. And honeybees have become crucial to our agriculture, but they also can displace native bee species.
Do you have a geological selection or collection at the museum? Some natural history museums include abiotics too. Is that true?
Well, by abiotics,
rocks, asteroid hits.
Oh, right. So we do not have a mineral collection in the museum. We donated that. We had one, and we donated it to the Colorado School of Mines, which has a very large rock and mineral collection, so we don't have one of those. In terms of abiotic, we have our anthropology collection, which would be considered abiotic. But we don't have those kinds of things. We just didn't have room for them all.
Professor Bowers.
Yes, sir.
The myth of our Rotary Club is that the responder is to keep the speaker from over-talking. In truth, it is to stop the questioners from asking so many questions. So it's glad that's been revealed today. I know many of us will leave today feeling much more erudite than we felt when we came in, especially on topics of toilet paper and such things. But thank you sincerely for agreeing to talk to us. I think all of us have found this fascinating. And as you know, Rotary has been a major participant in the eradication of polio. And in that respect, in your honor, the Boulder Rotary Club is pleased to contribute 100 doses of vaccine to the Polio Plus Fund. Thank you very much.